The story I am going to share today sounds like a haunting piece of fiction, but it happened for real, right here in modern Italy. It is a narrative that unfolds in the quiet corners of elegant city streets and behind the heavy doors of private residences. Perhaps, as the details emerge, you will recognize a flicker of your own life reflected in the shadows. This is the story of Renata. She arrived with little more than a suitcase and a singular, burning hope. She climbed toward the life she envisioned, dancing across stages and building a future from the ground up. But the dream she chased held a hidden cost. Beneath the surface of her success lay a reality that few saw, a slow erosion of her autonomy that began the moment she opened her heart to the wrong person. This is not just a story of survival. It is a testament to the internal shift required to break free. Listen closely, because the path she carved out of the darkness might be the exact map you need to find your own way home. Your journey through her experiences begins now. Renata stepped off the train at 18, the cold air of Milan biting at her skin. She carried one suitcase. Inside were no riches, only the weight of her potential and a desperate driving hope. She did not know the language, but she knew how to move. She found work on the city stages, night after night, pushing her body until her lungs burned and her muscles ached. The rhythm of the music became her anchor in a foreign land. She performed for crowds that never saw the woman behind the motion, only the dancer. Every coin she earned was split. One portion fed her, the other she sent back across the ocean to her family. Her life was defined by the transition from the humid warmth of Brazil to the relentless pace of the Italian industry. She slept in small, cramped rooms, but she walked the city streets as if she owned them. Her ambition was a physical hunger. She was not just surviving, she was securing her place in a city that demanded everything from those who dared to want more. With every performance, the distance between the girl with the suitcase and the woman she intended to become grew smaller. 3 years. 1,095 days of constant motion. Renata tracked every cent, sacrificing sleep to pick up extra shifts. She stopped buying anything that did not serve her ultimate goal. She lived in a state of perpetual calculation, watching her savings grow in a small bank ledger. The apartment building stood on a quiet, tree-lined street in the heart of Milan. She walked past it every morning on her way to rehearsals, tracing the lines of the stone facade with her eyes. She knew the weight of every floorboard before she ever set foot inside. The day finally arrived. She sat across from the agent, her hands steady as she signed the papers. When the keys were pressed into her palm, the metal felt cold and heavy. She walked to the building, climbed the stairs, and stopped before the door. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. She pushed the door open. The space was empty, filled with sunlight and the smell of polished wood. She stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned her back against it. For the first time in 3 years, the noise of the city fell away. She was home. The silence of the new apartment was quickly replaced by the hum of a different life. Renata began attending galas and legal functions, moving through rooms filled with the city's elite. It was at one such evening, under the soft glow of a chandelier, that Alberto first approached. He spoke with a precision that demanded attention. He was a lawyer, his name carried weight, and he navigated the crowd with a practiced ease that Renata found intoxicating. He did not just talk, he made promises of a life without struggle. He sent flowers that filled her halls. He arranged dinners at restaurants that were otherwise impossible to book. For a woman who had spent years fighting for every inch of ground, his arrival felt like a sudden cessation of conflict. She saw a protector, she saw a bridge to a future where she would never have to work until exhaustion again. He spoke of family, of deep roots, and of a shared path. Renata, still unaccustomed to the weight of her own independence, found the prospect of surrendering it to him surprisingly light. When he finally asked her to leave her empty apartment and join him in his world, she did not hesitate. She packed her bags and walked out, believing she was stepping into a sanctuary. The transition was seamless at first, but the atmosphere inside the apartment shifted within days. Alberto moved through the rooms, with a ruler-straight focus. He insisted on a specific order for every object, from the alignment of books to the angle of the chairs. Renata found herself adjusting the coasters on the coffee table, checking their position twice before he entered the room. She walked through the hallway with measured steps, avoiding the creaky floorboards he disliked. Every evening, he inspected the kitchen counters after she finished cleaning. He did not say much, but his eyes tracked the smallest smear of water on the marble. Renata began to watch her own hands, afraid of making a clumsy movement that would draw his attention. She stopped leaving her belongings on the side tables. She stopped moving furniture to capture the afternoon light. The apartment remained pristine, silent, and cold. It was a beautiful gallery, but she felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She stood in the center of the living room, hands clasped, waiting for the sound of his key in the door. The dread was a physical weight, settling in her chest before he even arrived home. The criticism did not arrive with a shout, but with a quiet, devastating precision. Alberto would sit at the dining table staring at a single water spot on a glass and let the silence stretch until Renata spoke first. "It is just a mark," she would offer, her voice thin. He would look up, his eyes devoid of warmth, and dismantle her worth with a few measured sentences. He spoke of her lack of attention, her inability to grasp basic standards, and her tendency to ruin the environment he had cultivated. He called her careless. He called her messy. Each word stung more than a physical blow, leaving her standing in the kitchen, trembling. She started to believe him. If he was this demanding, it must be. Because he wanted the best for them, she reasoned. She began to anticipate his critiques, scanning the apartment for flaws before he could find them. When he sighed at the way she folded a towel or corrected her pronunciation of a word, she apologized, convinced she had failed him yet again. She viewed his coldness as a test of her devotion. She tightened her grip on the life they shared, certain that if she only worked harder, if she only became smaller and more precise, he would finally be satisfied. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening. A glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor tiles. The sound was sharp, final. Alberto did not look up from his papers at first, but his jaw tightened. He stood, his movements stiff and deliberate. He walked to the center of the kitchen, staring at the scattered shards. Renata reached down to clean the mess, her hands shaking, but he stopped her with a sudden, forceful grip on her upper arm. His fingers dug into her skin, his thumb pressing hard against the muscle. She gasped, frozen by the sudden shift in his demeanor. He leaned in, his breath cold against her ear, demanding to know why she could not follow basic instructions. The pain in her arm was sharp, but the shock was worse. He released her abruptly, leaving her to stumble back against the counter. She did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she stared at the floor, her mind racing to find a reason for her own clumsiness. She convinced herself that if she had simply been more careful, he would never have reacted that way. She knelt among the glass, her pulse hammering, already planning how to be perfect enough to ensure it would never happen again. The walls of their apartment began to feel less like a home and more like a perimeter. Alberto started questioning her timeline for every errand. He checked the timestamps on her messages, demanding to know who she had spoken to and why. If a friend called, he would sit nearby, his presence a heavy weight, until she ended the conversation abruptly. Renata did not see the cage. She saw a man who could not bear to be apart from her. She mistook his constant surveillance for a desperate, burning need for her company. When he interrogated her about a casual interaction at the grocery store, she did not feel insulted. She felt cherished. She told herself that no one had ever cared enough to be that observant, that jealous, or that protective. She began to decline invitations to see her friends, citing his busy schedule or her own desire to be home when he returned. She erased her own social boundaries to keep him comfortable, believing that this sacrifice was the price of a rare, intense love. Every time he demanded she stay within his sight, she felt a surge of pride, misreading his possessiveness as a shield against the world. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, convinced that his jealous grip was the only thing keeping her safe. The test sat on the marble vanity, the 2 lines a quiet promise of change. Renata looked at the result, her hands resting on her stomach. A strange, sudden warmth spread through her. She believed this was the missing piece, the bridge that would finally bring the peace they had lost. She imagined the silence in the apartment being replaced by the soft sounds of a child, a force of life that even Alberto could not ignore. That evening, she waited for him in the living room, the air thick with her unspoken news. When he arrived, his face remained a mask of practiced indifference. But she reached for his hand, pressing it gently against her side. She told him the news, watching his eyes for a flicker of softness. He did not pull away, but he did not smile. He simply stared, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his work. Renata clung to that moment of stillness, convincing herself that he was merely processing the gravity of fatherhood. For the next few months, she lived in a fragile bubble of anticipation. She spent her days preparing the nursery, convinced that the arrival of a daughter would melt the frost that had settled over their lives. She was building a future on a foundation of faith, certain that this child would be the salvation of their home. The nursery was ready, but the silence that followed the birth was not the peace Renata had prayed for. When she brought their daughter home, she waited for the warmth of a father, but Alberto merely looked at the cradle as if it were an intruder in his perfect order. He did not hold the baby. He retreated further into his study, the door clicking shut with finality. The sound of a cry now triggered his immediate irritation. He complained about the lack of sleep, the disruption of his schedule, and the sudden clutter of toys that violated his pristine living room. Renata watched, stunned. As his coldness hardened into active resentment, he began to dictate strict rules for the child, demanding absolute silence during his working hours. The apartment, once a symbol of her dreams, transformed into a tomb of expectations. He stopped speaking to her entirely, leaving notes about household failures instead of engaging in conversation. Renata found herself walking on eggshells, constantly moving to dampen the baby's sounds, terrified that a single whimper would provoke his rage. She was no longer a partner. She was a warden in a quiet, suffocating prison where every breath was measured against his rigid demands for control. 3 years stretched into a blur of calculated movements and held breaths. Every morning, Renata checked the house for any sign of disorder that might trigger an outburst. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps before he even entered a room, and she adjusted her own pace to avoid his line of sight. Leaving seemed impossible. She looked at the polished surfaces of their home and felt the weight of the life she had built. If she walked out, the neighbors would whisper, the clients would judge, and the perfect image she had fought so hard to maintain would collapse. That fear kept her anchored. She became an expert at predicting his moods, reading the tension in his jaw as a warning to retreat. She spoke in whispers, moved with caution, and spent hours cleaning areas he had already deemed insufficient. When people visited, she wore a rehearsed smile, playing the role of the devoted wife, while her heart raced at the slightest shift in his tone. She was trapped in a web of her own making, terrified that any move to break free would result in the loss of everything she had ever worked for. The world saw a successful family, but inside, she was merely waiting for the next storm to pass, trapped by the crushing pressure of maintaining an illusion that had become her cage. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. The child, barely 3, dropped a ceramic mug in the kitchen. The sound of porcelain shattering against the tile triggered an immediate roar from the hallway. Alberto marched into the room, his face rigid, and pointed at the shards. He did not look at the mess. He looked at the toddler, who had frozen in place. He began to scream, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, criticizing the girl for her clumsiness. Renata moved to shield her, but he shoved her aside with a sharp motion of his shoulder. She watched her daughter shrink away, hands trembling, eyes wide, with a terror that no child should ever know. That look was the catalyst. In that moment, the facade of their perfect home splintered beyond repair. Renata realized that staying was no longer just about her own survival. She saw the fear taking root in the child, a reflection of her own shadow. She stepped between them, her own hands steady for the first time in years. She did not speak. She simply picked up the child, turned her back on him, and walked out of the kitchen. The silence that followed was heavy, but for the first time, it was not the silence of submission. It was the sound of a decision taking shape. Renata watched her daughter in the quiet of the nursery. The child was playing with a wooden block, but her eyes darted toward the door whenever a floorboard creaked. That reaction was the final push. Renata began to act, not with words, but with calculated movements. She started by gathering the documents she would need: passports, birth certificates, and bank statements. She hid them inside the lining of her winter coat, tucked behind a loose stitch. Every time he left for the office, she had exactly 8 hours to map out a reality outside these walls. She searched the internet on her phone in the bathroom, memorizing bus routes and local shelters. She began setting aside small amounts of cash, hiding the bills inside the hollowed-out base of a lamp. Each night, she practiced how to carry the child and the bag in one movement. She stopped seeking his approval, offering only short, neutral replies to his questions. He noticed the shift in her tone, but she masked it as fatigue. She was building a bridge out of the silence, one hidden detail at a time. She looked at her daughter again, touched her hair, and whispered to the air, "We are leaving." The plan was set. The cycle would stop with her. The apartment felt smaller than usual. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward the door. Alberto was gone, but his presence lingered in the rigid placement of the furniture and the smell of his cologne that clung to the curtains. Renata moved through the hallway, avoiding the floorboards she knew would creak. She reached the nursery, where her daughter sat waiting, still and silent, as if she understood the stakes. Renata lifted the child, wrapping her in a thick blanket, and pressed her back against the wall. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay perfectly still. She gripped the edge of the doorframe, knuckles white, holding her breath until the sound faded past their unit. It was only the neighbor. She exhaled a slow, shuddering release of air. She checked the bag one last time, ensuring the passport was secure. The hallway was empty. The keys felt cold and heavy in her palm. The air in the room was thick, charged with the weight of the coming transition. She looked at the door, then back at her daughter. The path was clear, but the silence of the apartment felt like a warning. She gripped the handle, ready to cross the threshold into the unknown. Renata turned the key. The metal clicked with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. She did not look back at the apartment. She pulled the door shut, listening for the latch to click into place, then stepped into the corridor with her daughter held tight against her chest. The elevator indicator glowed, signaling its ascent. She could not risk an encounter. She pivoted and sprinted toward the stairwell, her boots muffled by the carpet. Each step down the concrete stairs felt like a physical tearing away from the life she had known. Her pulse drummed in her ears, louder than the city traffic below. She pushed through the heavy exit door into the lobby, the cold air hitting her face with sudden intensity. She reached the street and stood on the sidewalk, exposed under the wide gray sky. There was no shield here, no walls to hide behind, and no guarantee of safety. She looked left, then right, scanning for any sign of his car. The city noise felt overwhelming after 3 years of silence. She tightened her grip on her daughter, took a ragged breath, and began to walk. The first step was the hardest. The second step was freedom. Renata reached the ATM on the corner, her fingers trembling as she inserted the card. She needed cash for the bus, for milk, for a room for the night. The screen blinked, processed for a long, agonizing second, then displayed a cold, red message. Transaction denied. She tried again. The machine swallowed the card and locked the tray. She pulled at the plastic, but it was held firm by the internal mechanism. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an email from the firm where she had worked for 2 years. Her access to all digital files had been revoked. Her professional email was deleted. Then came the second notification, a legal notice from Alberto. He had filed an emergency injunction, freezing every joint asset they shared. He was not just ending their partnership, he was erasing her ability to survive. She stood on the sidewalk, the notification screen glowing with his name. The city noise blurred into a dull roar. She checked her wallet. 3 coins. A crumpled bill. The realization hit her with the weight of a stone. He had turned the law into a weapon, and he was using it to cut her off from everything she had built. The city lights began to flicker on, mocking her emptiness. Renata checked her pockets again. The 3 coins remained, but they were not enough for a meal. She walked past a bakery, the scent of warm bread drifting through the glass, and her stomach cramped in protest. She pulled her daughter close, shielding her from the sudden evening chill. They had not eaten since the previous night. She stopped at a public fountain, filling a plastic cup with tap water, and handed it to the child. The water was cold, bitter, and did nothing to dull the gnawing ache in her gut. She led her daughter to a park bench, tucked away from the main street. The wood was damp and hard. She sat, watching the commuters rush by, each one holding bags filled with groceries. She checked her phone for the 10th time, hoping for a miracle, but the battery icon turned red and the screen went black. The silence of the device mirrored the silence of her bank account. She leaned her head back against the cold metal of the bench, listening to the rhythmic breathing of her child and prepared to wait out the night in the shadows of the park. The streetlights turned off one by one, leaving the park in absolute shadow. Renata pulled her daughter tighter against her chest to share what little warmth remained, but the damp air seeped through their skin. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the relentless rhythm of her own thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alberto. She saw the courtroom documents, the stamped signatures, and the cold, measured tone of his voice that had dismantled her life. She tried to map out a tomorrow, a next step, a way to feed the child in her arms, but every path led back to a dead end. He had ensured she was isolated, penniless, and marked as the aggressor. A sob caught in her throat, sharp and jagged, but she choked it down, terrified that any sound might draw attention. She stared into the blackness of the trees, wondering if this was the end of her endurance. The pressure in her chest was a physical weight, a tightening vice that made every breath a conscious effort. She felt the crushing reality of her choice. She had walked away from the cage, but the bars were now following her everywhere she went. She was tired, so profoundly, bone-deep tired, that the thought of simply letting go flickered in her mind like a dying candle. The darkness remained, but the shaking in her hands began to subside. Renata rested her head against the rough wood of the bench and closed her eyes. She stopped fighting the cold and instead focused on the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of her daughter. In that quiet, she reached for something beyond the reach of legal documents and threats. She began to pray. Not for a miracle to erase the past, but for the clarity to endure the present. The frantic noise of her own panic slowly receded, replaced by a singular, sharp realization. His malice was a shadow, and shadows only existed where she allowed them to stay. She felt the tension in her shoulders loosen just a fraction. She did not need his permission to exist. She did not need his approval to move forward. The terror that had anchored her to this bench began to dissolve. She opened her eyes, watching the first faint hint of gray light touch the horizon. She stood up, brushed the dampness from her knees, and tightened her grip on her child. The fear was still there, but it no longer held the leash. She looked toward the exit of the park, took a slow, deliberate breath, and walked forward. The path was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was hers. Renata walked until the sun was high and the city noise drowned out her own doubts. She entered office after office, holding her breath as she presented her story. Some lawyers looked at the documents Alberto had prepared, saw his name, and politely showed her the door. The rejection stung, a cold reminder of his reach and his shadow. Her resolve wavered on the steps of the third firm, her hand trembling on the door handle. She felt the familiar urge to turn back, to hide in the silence. Instead, she pushed the door open. Inside, a woman sat behind a desk, listening without interrupting, without judgment. She did not flinch when Renata described the threats or the isolation. She pulled a fresh file from the drawer, laid it open, and asked for the full timeline of events. That single act of professional focus felt like armor. They spent hours charting a strategy, building a wall of evidence against the lies Alberto had constructed. As the sun set, they signed the first motion. It was not a victory yet, but it was a declaration of war. Renata left the office, the heavy stack of paperwork tucked under her arm. The city looked different now. It was no longer a cage, but a landscape she was preparing to reclaim. The courtroom air was thin and smelled of floor wax. Renata sat at the table, her hands locked in her lap, feeling the vibration of the room through the wood. Alberto sat across the aisle. He did not look at her directly at first, but his presence was a heavy, calculated weight. When he finally turned, he offered a thin, practiced smile, a gesture meant to signal his absolute dominance to the room. He leaned toward his counsel, his voice a low, deliberate murmur that cut through the silence. He spoke of her instability, weaving a narrative of neglect and hysteria. Renata felt the old reflex to shrink, to apologize, but she anchored her heels into the floor. She watched him lie. She watched the way he manipulated the timeline, turning her survival into a character flaw. Each word was a strike, but she did not flinch. She observed the way his eyes flickered toward the judge, searching for validation. He was performing, and for the first time, she saw the performance for exactly what it was, a desperate, hollow defense. She took a slow, steady breath. When it was her turn to speak, she did not look at his anger. She looked at the judge, held her posture, and prepared to dismantle every word he had built. The judge listened to the final rebuttal, her pen moving with a rhythmic, scratching sound that seemed to dictate the rhythm of the room. Alberto shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening as the evidence was reviewed. He tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The air felt heavy, saturated with the weight of months of fear. Then, the judge spoke. She dismissed his request for a summary judgment and issued a protective order. The sound of the gavel was sudden, sharp, and final. It cut through the tension like a blade. Alberto turned, his face pale, his mask of control slipping into a raw, ugly sneer. Renata did not look at him. She felt the sudden lightness in her own chest, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her lungs. She stood, collected her files, and walked toward the exit. Her hands were no longer shaking. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights were harsh, but they felt like daylight. She took a breath, deep and clean, and realized for the first time in years that the path ahead was clear. She had gained time. She had gained space. She had gained herself. The lecture hall was cold, smelling of stale coffee and dry erase markers. Renata sat in the back row, her notebook open and pen poised, waiting for the professor to begin. The first week felt like learning to walk again. Her mind kept drifting to the silence of her old apartment, the constant need for vigilance, and the way she used to anticipate Alberto's moods. She would stare at the whiteboard, the marketing theories blurring into abstract shapes. A surge of doubt would rise in her throat, a phantom echo of his criticism. She would grip her pen until her knuckles turned white, forcing her focus back to the page. She highlighted the terms, repeated the definitions, and forced herself to participate in group discussions. Each lecture was a mental anchor. She was not just learning strategies to sell products. She was building a foundation for her own survival. When the clock ticked toward the end of the hour, she felt a quiet, steady rhythm returning to her pulse. She was no longer a subject in someone else's narrative. She was a student of her own future. She closed her book, walked into the sunlight of the campus courtyard, and took a breath that belonged entirely to her. The marketing project was demanding, requiring hours of research in the library stacks. Renata spent her afternoons mapping consumer behavior, her fingers tracing data points on thick sheets of graph paper. There was no one to critique the angle of her work or the neatness of her margins. She found a strange, quiet power in the lack of feedback. She presented her analysis to the class, her voice steady, as she explained the logic behind her strategy. When the professor nodded and offered a brief, professional compliment, Renata did not flinch. She did not look for a hidden insult or a trap. She simply accepted the validation as a fair assessment of her effort. That evening, she walked through the city streets, the lights of Milan reflecting in the puddles. She realized then that her value was not a currency to be traded for his approval. She was a creator, not an object. She checked her reflection in a shop window, not for flaws, but to acknowledge the person looking back. The doubt that had anchored her for so long was finally losing its grip. She moved with a purpose that felt entirely her own, her stride lengthening as the city opened up before her. The morning light hit the glass of the bathroom mirror, revealing a face Renata barely recognized. It was not the hollowed-out mask she had worn for years. She stood still, leaning closer until her breath fogged the surface. A memory surfaced, Alberto's voice, cold and sharp, listing all the ways she was insufficient. She felt the familiar jolt of panic, the instinct to apologize for existing. She reached out, her fingers tracing the frame. She remembered the legal notices, the threats that would strip her of her future, and the calculated cruelty designed to keep her small. But today, the fear was different. It was a static noise, not a command. She watched her own eyes, steady and unblinking. She spoke, her voice low but firm, cutting through the silence of the room. Enough. The word hung in the air, solid and final. She saw the change in her expression, the tension in her jaw dissolving. The threats that once felt like iron bars now looked like paper. She had reclaimed the narrative. She stepped back, turned away from the reflection, and walked toward the door. She was no longer living in the shadow of his judgment. She had found her voice, and for the first time, it was loud enough to drown out the past. The results of her effort began to manifest in the bustling corridors of her new workplace. Renata walked into the office with a stack of reports, the weight of them a reminder of her autonomy. Her manager called for a strategy review, a meeting where the air was thick with expectation. She took her place at the head of the table, laying out her marketing data with precision. When questions came, she answered without hesitation, her logic sharp and her evidence clear. There was no room for doubt. She owned the space. By the end of the week, the lead project was hers to direct. She felt the shift in her daily rhythm, the constant grinding anxiety of the past replaced by the steady hum of productivity. She moved through the city with a new sense of ownership, no longer dodging ghosts, but meeting the future head-on. She checked her bank account, not with fear of depletion, but with the satisfaction of earned independence. The stability she had once begged for, she had now built with her own hands. She sat at her desk late one evening, the office quiet, and watched the city lights. Everything she had worked for was finally real, and for the first time, it was entirely hers to keep. Renata stood by her window, the city lights below blurring into a soft glow. She looked around her apartment, a modest space compared to the grand building of her past, yet it felt infinitely larger. She counted the losses in her mind, the status, the ease of a life built on someone else's terms, the comfort of borrowed wealth. They had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the clothes she stood in and the skills she had fought to learn. She reached into a small drawer and pulled out a single tarnished key, a relic from her former life. She held it for a moment, feeling the cold weight of the metal, then dropped it into the trash. The sound of it hitting the bottom was final. She realized then that the things she had once feared losing were never truly hers. The only thing that mattered, the one thing that could never be confiscated or stripped away, was her own soul. She had traded a gilded cage for an unadorned freedom. She walked back to her desk, sat down, and felt the weight of her own history settling into place, not as a burden, but as a foundation. She was finally undeniably herself. If you are listening to this and you feel a sudden, sharp recognition in your chest, pay attention. Perhaps you see the same shadows in your own life that Renata once fought to escape. Maybe you know the sound of a door locking, or the way the air changes temperature when someone enters the room. You have spent years justifying the unjustifiable. telling yourself that the criticism, the isolation, or the constant need for perfection is simply a part of your reality. You are not alone in this. Thousands of people are currently sitting exactly where you are, staring at the same walls, wondering if there is a way out. The patterns of control are designed to make you feel isolated, as if your experience is a secret you must keep. But silence is the fuel that keeps those patterns alive. When you hear these words, recognize them as a signal. You are capable of seeing the truth of your situation, and that clarity is the first crack in the foundation of your captor's power. You do not have to move mountains today. You only need to acknowledge that what you are enduring is real and that you deserve to breathe without fear. Let us be clear about one thing. What you are experiencing is not love. Love does not demand your silence. It does not thrive on your fear or measure your worth by your ability to follow impossible rules. If you are constantly walking on eggshells, weighing every word before you speak, or shrinking yourself to avoid an outburst, you are not in a partnership. You are in a cage. Real love builds you up. It does not tear your confidence apart until you no longer recognize your own face in the mirror. You deserve a life where your presence is celebrated, not policed. You deserve to sleep without the weight of tension pressing on your chest. This realization might feel overwhelming, but it is the most important truth you will ever hold. You do not need to solve everything at once. Just identify the next small step. It could be reaching out to a friend, finding a safe place to store your documents, or simply acknowledging that your current reality is not permanent. Your story does not have to end in pain. It is waiting for you to define your own new beginning. Take that step, reclaim your voice, and choose the peace that has been yours all along. Thank you so much for choosing to spend these minutes with this story. It takes courage to look at the truth, and by staying until the very end, you have already taken a meaningful step toward awareness. If this message resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. Your support does more than just help us grow. It ensures that these stories reach the people who need them most. Please leave a like on this video to help the algorithm share this message with those currently trapped in the dark. It is a simple gesture, but it can be a lifeline for someone who feels they have nowhere else to turn. Click on the card appearing on your screen to watch the next story, where we continue to explore the path toward freedom and self-discovery. Remember, you are not alone in this journey. There is a whole community here waiting to stand with you. Keep your head high, trust in your own strength, and never stop fighting for the peace you deserve. A big kiss to each and every one of you, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Take care.